Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Outdoor Adventure Series on the Success Insight podcast. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration of the great outdoors. Our guest today is Patrick Durkin. Patrick is an award-winning outdoor writer with nearly 40 years on the job. While he covers mainly Wisconsin, Patrick is a wildlife research contributing writer for MeatEater, and he also writes nationally for Outdoor Life and Quality Whitetails. He is also the current president of the Wisconsin Outdoor Comunicators Association. Patrick, welcome to the Outdoor Adventure Series on the Success Insight podcast.
Thanks, Howard. That was a nice introduction.
Thank you. Well, for our listeners, I have to, in the spirit of full disclosure, I have to admit that last weekend, or actually 2 weekends ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Patrick in person because I was invited by WOCA to speak on the topic of podcasting at their annual meeting up in the North Woods of Wisconsin, up in Eagle River at the Trees Resort. And what a fantastic experience. And, Patrick, it was a topic that, I'm an outdoors person per se. I love the outdoors here in the West, in Nevada, but growing up in Michigan, I've never even fished in my life. I have to admit that. So having you on the podcast today is just really to talk about what it means to be an outdoor enthusiast. So thank you again.
Well, great. Thanks, Howard.
So
happy to be here.
Yeah. So before we kind of jump into this idea of being an outdoor enthusiast and all that it entails and how you've made quite a career in this area, I wonder if you could perhaps share a little bit about your background and, how did you begin to kind of have this appreciation for the great outdoors and eventually kind of make your career doing the writing for it?
Yeah, I really trace my roots on this to a really early start. I was one of these lucky kids back in the 60s whose grandmother lived with our family. And my grandmother was very good at teaching you stuff without really letting you know you're learning anything. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways I look back in that with a lot of real appreciation is I remember her giving me a hatchet when I was like maybe 5 years old. And in the process, I was taught how to identify various trees and tree species by their bark. And then she'd kind of turn me loose. She'd say, you can chop down all the black locust trees you want, knowing for a little kid with a little 5-year-old kid with a hatchet, it'd take forever to chop down one tree. But, I learned the difference between black locust, fox elder, silver maple, and these other, what she considered weed species around her flower gardens. And anytime anything was like within chopping size of a 5-year-old, I went at it. And that was also a way I started learning about birds. She was really good at pointing out different bird species. And I just got interested in that, and along the way, I think one of the real formative things for me was because she was basically a single mother. She had a husband, my grandfather at the time, but he wasn't always around. And when he was around, it wasn't always pleasant. But she, so it kind of took care of raising 4 kids on her own. And she'd tell these stories about how much they valued things like freshly caught bullheads or bluegills, or someone like one of our boys would shoot a rabbit once in a while, bring home a rabbit. And during the Depression, any kind of meat her family could get was highly valued. So those kind of stories, I think, always really struck a chord with me as a kid. I could just kind of picture what it must have been like when you didn't really have ready access to meat. And then, she'd talk about quite often how she would give her kids meals where the main feature, the main course was this tomato soup. And so anyway, I grew up hearing these kind of stories, and I, for some reason, always had an interest in hunting and fishing. And I think a lot of that came from her. That she wasn't really into hunting or fishing, but she sure appreciated it when people in her family, could bring home any kind of meat. And then later, when I started hunting pretty seriously and occasionally bringing home a deer, that was really special. You could tell that really impressed her that somebody could kill a deer with a bow and arrow. so, so that's where I got my interest, I think.
I think your grandmother had a method to what was going on there. It was like, she may not have specifically enjoyed the hunt. I mean, she had her garden, but the teachings that she shared with you, your siblings, it was very much there was an agenda there. Is bring home the meal, I'll cook it for you.
Right. Yeah, it was. She had a real utilitarian view toward farm animals and pets. Even I remember her being really strict about if you brought home a stray cat, she wasn't real wild about it because she knew that would mean more responsibility for the family to take care of this animal. And it's interesting now when I see so many different viewpoints on pet ownership and animal treatment or mistreatment, whatever it might be. It's interesting to reflect on how utilitarian she was. And that basically the animal, its best bet to get through was to serve some kind of function, one way or another. So
Sure.
if a cat caught mice and caught chipmunks that were burrowing on her garden, that cat, she liked it.
Sure.
But if it was a cat that just laid around and got in the way and just wanted to be fed, you could tell she didn't have a whole lot of affection for it.
Sure. I'm reminded, I don't know the origin of it, but perhaps that might have been my brother-in-law. He grew up in a farm in Midland, Michigan, and I seem to recall, again, I can't be certain, that from his family that the pets were supposed to be outside.
Yeah.
Being that utilitarian member of the family, they weren't allowed in the house. I've got to ask a question. I had mentioned in the introduction that you have spent really a great part of your life in Wisconsin. Where are you originally from?
I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, originally, the state capital.
Okay.
And I lived there till I was 19, and I went into the Navy. And then when I got out of the Navy, I was married by the time I got out of the Navy, and I was like 5 years. And my wife, who's from New Jersey, we moved to East Central Wisconsin. My parents owned a house on a lake. It was only like 17 miles from the university up there, the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, which had a journalism program. So my dad rented this small house on the lake for like $200 a month while I went to college.
Wow.
And then once I was out of college, that was kind of his contribution to my college education. So it was a good deal, and plus I had the GI Bill. So and my wife was working. So when I got back into college, I was able to really focus on college. I was older than the typical students, and so I sailed right through like in 3 years. Then I was eager to get out and start working, I think.
Sure. I sometimes look back and I wish I had gone into the armed services, probably the Air Force, but like my dad was a Navy, his first stint in in World War II, and then he was in the Air Force, or maybe it was flipped because I know he was out in the Pacific. When you came back, when did this? And you went to school up in Oshkosh. When did you begin to start focusing on journalism? Had you always been a writer, or how did you kind of get into this line of work?
It's a good question, because when I went into the Navy, my whole goal, my dad was at the time, my dad's career was in firefighting in Madison. And by the time I got out of the Navy, he was actually fire chief in Madison. And so my goal in the Navy was to get all this firefighting and damage control expertise. And that's what I did in the Navy. I was what was called a hull maintenance technician. So I got lots of training in firefighting and stuff. And what was interesting though, by the time I got out of the Navy, I also was taught a lot of interesting skills like welding and sheet metal work and other fabrication work that you needed to be a good damage controlman. And what was interesting about that for me is I kind of learned along the way that I'm not mechanically inclined. And a lot of these skills that the Navy taught me, they're good skills, good trade skills. I started to realize I wasn't very good at them though. And at the same time, I was also writing home a lot because I was, either 1,000 miles away or else, you know, 4,000 miles away when we're overseas. And so I wrote a lot of letters back in those days. And eventually I started using a typewriter because it was more efficient to type out letters than to write them out longhand.
Sure.
In the process, I started hearing back from people like my grandmother again and my friends that, you ever thought about going into journalism? You're a pretty good writer. And it was kind of funny because my dad, when I went into the Navy, had told me, he had looked at the recruiting information and saw the Navy had actually has a journalism program for enlisted men, and that working on ship newsletters and that kind of stuff. And so I thought it was ironic that I ended up going to journalism and just kind of left the firefighting idea behind, which to this day I still have mixed feelings about, but I've had a good career, so I can't complain.
Very good. Now, when you started, with your career as a journalist, how did that evolve into writing within the outdoor genre?
Yeah, it's one thing. Once I really decided I wanted to go into journalism, I knew I wanted to. My goal is to become an outdoor editor at a major newspaper. Like, I always had my eyes on the Milwaukee Journal outdoor job. And then what was always interesting, Howard, is I really loved newspaper work. After about 8 years of it, though, in Oshkosh, I got offered this job to be an editor be the editor of a magazine called Deer and Deer Hunting Magazine. And it was I had a hard time at the time making a decision on whether to leave the newspaper world and go into magazines. And then in retrospect, now I'm glad I did because I was able to keep writing my weekly newspaper column on the outdoors, which I've still done now for like almost 40 straight years every week. Haven't missed a week now for, since I started back in 1984 with the column.
That's an accomplishment.
Thank you.
Wow.
I take a lot of pride in it. And so it's I always figure, when people tell me, Howard, ask me questions like, when I hear people asking young people, what's your 5-year plan? I always just kind of shake my head and think, I never had a 5-year plan. My plan was just to work my butt off and always be in position to step into the next job when the opportunity arose. And I've kind of, even now at age 65, I still kind of take that approach that I'm not ready to retire yet. No one really wants a 65-year-old guy to be a staffer in a full-time staff position. But you never know. One good thing about being a writer is very important to always keep in mind that you never know who's watching, you never know who's reading, and so every effort you make, everything you write, better be your best effort. So,
Of course.
and I always think that's the best solid advice I can give someone is to act like you're always writing for your next employer.
I love that. And, it's a realization for me as a coach, and a lot of my work is on career coaching, career development coaching. But and like you, I was always asked, where do you want to be in 5 years, 10 years? As though you're going to still be with this company,
right,
who would just as soon let you go when times got tough. Yeah. And in reality, our career is a very much a winding road.
Yeah.
Because you never know where it's going to take you, but it's very much a winding road. And you, as you said, rightly so, you have to be ready. Who's watching, who's heard you, who's seen you, been around you, and you never know where those opportunities are going to come along. As you were working within this space, you were writing, you've got your column. Let's talk about the column. Okay. I mean, 40 years, that's quite a collection. I think there's a book in you. Maybe there already has been the book of the best of Patrick Durkin. Who knows?
I've never done a book. I've never done a compilation, and part of that might be just that I've never taken the time to really put a lot of thought into it. I've always been really it sounds like I'm a mercenary, which I guess I am, but I've always focused on this week and the next 2 weeks, next 3 weeks. I never thought much beyond that as far as what I'm writing about, and I never have really put a whole lot of thought into how to sustain income, kind of just by letting my previous work do the work for me. And I know friends who have done pretty well putting out ebooks by taking past things I've written and just kind of repackaging and putting it out there in ebook form. But I've never done that. I've written one book cover to cover, and I basically did that as a semi ghostwriter for a guy he was Tom Inderbo, is the book on basically how to take your own piece of property and start producing decent deer on it, for deer hunting. And
Okay.
so I basically sat down with him over the course of a few weeks and interviewed him a number of times, and eventually came up with the chapter outline and then wrote the book. But as far as doing it for myself, I've never done that. And I think the other thing too, Howard, it might change now with the era of ebooks. But back in the 90s, I used to look at the idea of doing a compilation, because by that time I already had like 15, 16, 17 years in writing a weekly outdoor column. And then I read that even the best known writers in our country, like at that time, it was one of the guys I remember reading a lot was Mike Reichel at the Chicago Tribune.
Sure.
And Reichel just had this, he wrote like 3 times a week, I think, maybe even 5 times. No, he wrote almost like every day of the week. And even his compilations weren't huge sellers, but he made good money on them. But the thing I kept reading about was that compilations typically didn't sell enough to where that most publishers wanted them. Well, that was in the era too, though, before self-publishing and before ebooks. So I sound kind of delinquent here, but I never have really looked into it in recent years when it might make sense.
Well, what's interesting about the articles in how about how many words about are those articles in length?
Yeah, when I started freelancing after my first 8 years at the newspaper, I started freelancing that column here in Wisconsin. And those columns in the early days were being bought by then the Green Bay Press Gazette and the Wisconsin State Journal, and they both wanted them to be about 700 words.
Okay.
And then in recent years, though, I'm not sure why or how, but when Green Bay got taken over by Gannett, and Gannett bought up a bunch of other newspapers around Wisconsin, they asked me to stretch the columns out to 1,000 words, and so I've been at 1,000 words now weekly for about, I'm saying, at least 5, 6, 7 years.
Wow.
And that's yearly. When you're cranking out newspaper columns, you realize there's a big difference between 700 words and 1,000 words.
Sure.
It's you gotta get a little more in depth. But the thing I like about my job is that I like to think I'm a good reporter, and that I can get good, meaningful words out of those 300. I really do not believe in padding. I when I edit my final take on each column, it might not be the tightest possible, but it's about as tight as I can make it. I believe in tight writing.
Very good. Now I have 2 questions, and again, this is sort of the gotcha questions, but again, this is like throwing a lob, to home plate. So don't worry about it.
Yeah.
What would be your advice to someone today who has this aspiration for being a journalist? Because the role of a journalist today, there's so many competing stressors on that profession. And newspapers are going away, they're being consolidated, and they become more very politically slanted in some cases. So what advice would you give to that aspiring journalist who really, this is what I want to do?
I still think if I were to give, if they're my kids, my grandkids, I'd still stress to nail down the basics. Go get into college, get into a reputable journalism program that's accredited, and then really work your butt off. If this is what you want. I really believe there's nothing wrong with competition, and there's nothing wrong with the work ethic. That if you have those drives, you can still make a living at this. I liken it too, and the reason I push kids to go in a journalism school is I still look at one of the things that always fascinates me is when you read about the top musicians, the top songwriters, an awful lot of them had really good, strong musical formal training, whether at universities or special schools. It is not an accident that some of these people have really deeply embedded backgrounds in those professions. And when I read about a lot of people that are in journalism, I tend to really be defensive and protective of journalists, because I think the ones who are making it, the ones who have made it, typically you look at their pedigree and it's no accident. They went at it pretty hard. Not if not soon after high school, sometimes soon in their adulthood.
I appreciate that, and thank you for sharing that. And if you are writing these articles, and again, you have many years of experience and just the library of articles. What are in the outdoor space? What are the topics that perhaps you found really highly passionate? Like, I love this aspect of the outdoor space, or did everything have equal weight for you?
My go-to has always been deer. From the time I was a kid, I was fascinated with deer as a kid, and where it really came into focus for me was when I started working at Deer and Deer Hunting magazine. It almost seemed like just a natural fit that I never really pursued. But boy, when I got at the magazine I was hired at to run for 11 years, Deer and Deer Hunting magazine, I was really fortunate because that magazine's emphasis was, I think their tagline was practical and comprehensive information for whitetail deer hunters. And so I was very, very quickly adapted that. And I started attending university and agency conferences where they reported on deer and had research reporting on deer. And I learned to embrace that scientific approach where you had to dig into these research papers, which are some of the driest writing you can imagine, but they're packed with information. So it's my goal to always take that information, scientific information, and make it understandable and relatable for deer hunters.
And the topic that you contribute for MeatEaters, is that centered around the deer itself, or is it a lot more comprehensive than that?
That one, I think it provides reflection of my age. That as much as I love deer, I love other issues. I hate to sound morbid, but I do find it fascinating, some of the crime stories and stuff that happen in the outdoors, and just, some of these just gut wrenching or horrifying or human interest stories that spin through the outdoors. And I find all those topics interesting. And it's, for me, like this MeatEater gig I've had for the past 3.5 years, it came along at a point in my career where I like to think that it hit just perfect for both of us. That Steve Ranella, the guy who launched MeatEater, he appreciates a well-told story. And I always think it's interesting that he's built this big MeatEater brand from basically things that interest him. Well, at this point in my career, the great thing about getting older and having 40 years under your belt is along the way, you stumble across a lot of stories that maybe you didn't have time to develop much in your previous work. And now through MeatEater, I can start going back in my memory banks and actually pursuing some of these stories that I always wanted to tackle in the past, but just never had quite the right magazine or quite the right format, whatever it might be, to go after it. And So it's been kind of fun to see these stories now that I've had, banging around my head for decades in some cases, to finally have a chance to sit down and develop them into a 2,000 word feature article for MeatEater.
Fantastic. And I'm curious, last 2 weeks ago, 23rd and 24th at the Trees for Tomorrow, we had the WOCA annual meeting for 2021. Mm-hmm. There were some controversial topics that were raised. One, I guess, was the wolf kill and the numbers mm-hmm. and how it was pursued. And then during the segment, the panel discussion on podcasting, the young lady, her love is, trapping and skinning animals.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about the controversy around the topics of the outdoors. And again, in those 40 years of writing, the initial writings for the newspaper and what you're doing today for MeatEater, are there some controversies that continue to persist, or do they circle around? How does that? I was curious about that.
I can tell you with real certainty that anything involving deer has been controversial in deer hunting states since at least the 1930s. Since we since we started bringing back a lot of these animals that through habitat destruction and commercial and subsistence hunting, back in the 1800s, that North America, we really drove a lot of these populations right down into the basement. And, to think that 100 years ago, 120 years ago, a lot of the animals we're now hunting were all basically would have been, they didn't have an endangered species list back then, but things like white-tailed deer and wild turkeys and elk and all the things we're now hunting in big numbers were just really had been hammered. So then as they started to rebuild and rebound, deer have always generated controversy, tremendous controversy. And wolves too, I think going back long before then, you look at wolves, there's fairy tales that are built around the wolf.
Sure.
And it's just something in the human spirit and the human condition that wolves have always found a way to scare people, intrigue people. And to this day, we still fight about, really, are they an animal that we should be fearing or embracing and protecting? And I think, well, depending on the circumstances, all three of those things apply. And the other one I can tell you is that when I've been attacked most viciously, it's been when I've proposed that Wisconsin hold a sandhill crane hunting season. We can't hunt sandhill cranes in Wisconsin, even though our conservation efforts really brought back those populations in the past 3 decades or so. And you can hunt sandhill cranes in various parts of our country, but not in Wisconsin. So when I've written about why it makes sense now at this point, when we have established populations, we have scientific wildlife management, we could hunt sandhill cranes and not hurt the population one bit. But boy, you talk about getting the birders mad at you. That's a sure ticket to propose sandhill crane seasons.
Everybody has their flashpoint, and it's funny. I have good friends. They live up in Canada, and they have a farm, and they have sheep, and they have sheepdogs or Belgian shepherds.
Yep,
gorgeous Belgian shepherds. And my friend Renee is a professor in history, Islamic history, and she loves the wolf. And the wolf, the wolf, as you were saying, it goes down in history as being, inspirational, magical, has this unique power about it. And it was very well thought of way back, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And for me to even have this conversation about the topic at the WOCA conference 2 weeks ago, she would have been like up in arms.
Sure.
However, talk about a coyote who's jumping the fence and go after her sheep. This coyote is the worst thing in the world. Right. So as I was listening to that conversation going on, I kept thinking of my friend Renee and the irony of that conversation. So I've got another area I'd like to chat a little bit about. So as I was reading your blog, there was a story there about your wooden boat.
Oh, okay.
And, basically the cedar boat and just the uniqueness of taking it out and the fact that you pick up chicks with it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think I can't have pets in my apartment in Vegas, and I don't think there's lakes. Well, maybe Lake Mead, but it's dropping rapidly. I don't know how well a cedar boat would go, but whatever, because dating sites sure aren't helping. But the topic of boating, fishing, bringing the family into this activity of being outdoors, how is it the same? Did you find, say, looking back at how your grandmother introduced you and your siblings to, the wild? Here's the axe. By the way, if my grandmother had given my sister and I an axe, I might not be here, because my sister, she had an axe in her hand. I was going to be on the receiving end of it. I know that. What type of introduction to the wild, the outdoors, the appreciation for what it gives to us did you introduce to your family, your kids, as they were growing up?
Yeah. I raised 3 daughters. I never had a son, and my wife and I always had an agreement, and it was just something we both I think naturally had this feeling that we were going to have 3 kids, and whatever we had, and that whatever gender they were, I'd be taking them hunting and fishing. And my wife's not really into camping, but she likes to fish, and she's not really into hunting. But so I took all 3 of the girls hunting and fishing basically as soon as they could start walking around, and sometimes I had to carry them even. And to this day we still have the old red wagon that they grew up with.
The Red Ryder.
Yeah, the Red Ryder, and I used to call it our poor man's all-terrain vehicle, because I'd put my decoys in there for geese and put the youngest one in the wagon, and I'd haul them out to through cornfields, and we hide in the corn and put our decoys out in that area that had been cut, and then proceed to hunt geese. And so that's really how I liked goose hunting with the kids, because there was just enough action, just enough waiting, where you had to learn the patience of waiting. But typically, you got some reward for it. Not every day, but quite often you got enough shooting, enough activity to where they learned how to watch the sky for it. And then it was just interesting to watch as time went on. My oldest daughter, Leah, really took to it at a very young age, preschool. Pre-kindergarten age. She was really good at hearing the sounds and turning her head to look in that direction long before I could hear them. And it was just like a little radar unit, once she knew what she was doing. And I'd learned to trust her hearing that way better than my own. And then the same thing when I started taking her turkey hunting, I learned that she could hear gobbling in the distance much better than I could. And once I started to learn to trust her, give her credibility, man, it started to make a difference. And I learned too that she was better at hearing stuff close too. Like if I wanted to get the jump on something, we'd move along at the edge of the woods with her in front, because typically she'd either hear it or see it, because her eyesight was better than mine too. And so that was just kind of fun. Then fishing, all 3 of them fish. The 2 oldest ones were pretty good at it. And it was actually, you could tell they were kind of competitive about it.
Wow.
And then, but as time went on, though, our oldest daughter again kind of emerged as the one who was most serious about, where she'd get up in the middle of the night and go on Lake Michigan with me for salmon, because we'd have to leave the house at like 1:30 in the morning and drive over and be in the water before first light, because salmon on Lake Michigan would bite really best right at the crack of dawn. And if you're out there an hour after dawn, it was already too late for the best action. So, that was kind of fun just to see how the different girls, my different daughters, responded to it all, and what they embraced and what. But today, all three of them really want their kids to at least be exposed to it, because they all when I get an elk or something, they'll want those good select cuts of the elk, to stick in the freezer and wait for a good meal time. So it's been fun to watch that.
That's fantastic. And I mean, it must be such a joy to be able to introduce this also, or to be a part of this introduction, to your grandkids.
Yeah, yeah, and then because now it's funny how the grandkids are all between the ages of 1 and 7, and even at young ages, that they got some appreciation for the fact that I'm a hunter and a fisherman, and they don't quite understand. The younger ones really don't quite understand how it all comes together. But I'm confident. The thing I like about Howard so much is that I don't expect all of them to grow up to be hunters and fishermen, hunters and anglers, or whatever you want to call them. But I hope they'll be like their mothers and at least appreciate it.
Sure,
And
the
understand
appreciation.
it. Yeah, and that they won't just jump to conclusions and condemn it so often, like people tend to do toward hunting and fishing. Even though they really don't understand what goes on, they have assumptions and prejudices that come through in their thinking. And then once like so many prejudices, once you actually get into the nuance of it and understand hunting and fishing, it's interesting how often you can not. I don't know if the term is flip them, but you can at least get them to kind of withhold judgment and understand it.
Well, yes, it's so easy to jump to conclusions based on hearing somebody else without doing the investigation on your own and coming to your own conclusion. If you were to go out tomorrow and fish, hunt, what would you do? What would be that choice? If you could go out tomorrow, weather was going to be perfect, time of the year was perfect, what would that be?
Yeah, if was something I had to do, if I had to choose one to do all the time, it'd probably be fishing, just because you can fish year round.
Yeah.
Whereas hunting, you get locked into the spring turkey season for a few weeks, and then like in a month, I'll be leaving for my first hunt of the year. I always go out to Idaho and bow hunt for elk.
Oh wow!
And
can I come for that?
You're always welcome in my camp, Howard.
All right, I love that. I might tell you. I'm a very opportunistic individual, and I will share that with you. So be careful what you ask for.
Okay. I really will always appreciate these opportunities that we get, and I think again, it's one of these things that I appreciate even more with getting older, is that like the elk hunt, it's in really rugged country that's kind of forbidding, but at the same time you realize, boy, it's an experience. It's a much more there's a lot more, I don't know if the right word's adventure, but it's big country, and it's just really, and then when you get an elk, it's a real project to get that elk meat out of the woods and on ice, and then to like just to get it all cleaned up and ready to be packaged. That job alone takes close to a full day.
Sure.
And so it's just really a fun process of the hunt, and then the packing the elk back down to camp, and then getting it on ice. And then it's just, you really, by the time that piece of elk hits your plate, sometime over the next few months and year, you really appreciate it.
Sure.
And at the same time, though, the place I hunt from out there, typically if a friend comes along and they aren't really into the hunting, they go fishing. And once in a while, I'll come back and they'll have a trout, that we'll eat for the evening meal. But it's really, I feel blessed that way. I've the other thing I should say is that as serious as I take hunting and fishing, one great thing about being an outdoor writer, an outdoor journalist, is you meet people who, if you think you're serious about hunting or fishing, wait till you meet some of these guys. And some
Oh,
of these
I'm
women,
sure.
yeah,
I'm sure.
I mean, there's a whole different level there.
Well, this past week I had Dan Small, who was also on the at Wilka, and had the pleasure of meeting him. And I kind of alluded, Dan, I'm going to be. I expect I'm going to rejoin Wilka, and because I enjoyed myself, it was just great to meet new people and just I had fun. I'd never been to the North Woods of Wisconsin, and I shared with him, like I shared with you at the onset, I've never been fishing. I mean, I might have put a lure in the water and caught a little bluegill and throw it back, but nothing was eaten.
Yeah.
No fish was harmed. Well, actually, it might have been trying to get the hook out, but that's besides the point. And I was kind of joking, I'm coming up early because I want to go fishing. But the idea of going out like into Idaho and just the great outdoors out west, just vast open spaces, the sky. I mean, it's got to be an unbelievable experience. And the idea of bow hunting, I was actually very intrigued when the I forget what the panelist's name was, who has a podcast, and she's the metal chick. That was one of her
Carrie.
But she does bow hunting. I'm thinking, I bet you I can go get some bow hunting lessons out here, or bow lessons, just to my idea of hunting, Patrick, is to take a picture out in the desert at night, Milky Way.
Right.
But I love, even during the daytime, just going out, and my idea of shooting is with a camera, but that's besides the point.
Sure.
But just the idea of just, exploring other areas that I may never have been familiar with. And I think that's, again, the beauty of getting a little bit older and kind of living that dream. And speaking of getting older, and as we come towards the end of today's episode, you're involved in an activity that you started late in life and involved movement of your two legs. Tell us more about that.
Running, you must mean.
Yeah. I've never seen anybody. You're smiling right now. As for the folks that are listening to this session, I've got the camera on, Patrick's camera is on, and he's actually smiling as I said that. I've never seen a runner smile, but that's besides the point. But tell us about the running.
Yeah, I growing up, I did not like running. Running was always something that was done to you for punishment. The gym teacher make you run out to a distant tree and come back or something. And I remember the short time I played high school football, that's how they would often punish you if you forgot your assignment or whatever. They'd make you go for a run. In the Navy too, I remember in boot camp, to punish you, they'd make you run laps. And so I never liked running, and I I'd try it every now and then just for exercise, and just never could get into it. But when I finally realized what I was doing wrong, starting like in my late 40s, I'd say like when I was 48 or so, I started regularly working out, for weight training, just doing arms and chest and leg exercises to try to stay somewhat fit for hunting. And then after that went on for like 3 or 4 years, I didn't really realize, but it's really how you prepare to be able to run. You get your body ready for it. You don't try to run your way into fitness. You gotta get fit first. Get the muscles tuned up a little bit anyway. And so accidentally, I didn't realize, but I was getting myself ready to run. And then when I was about 51 years old, I was 51 years old. And I remember the previous year, my brother had run a 5K turkey trot on Thanksgiving morning. And I said to him, next year, I'm going to run that with you. And I did. A year later, I ran this 5K for Thanksgiving. It was a little fundraiser for the local Lions Club, I think it was. And for some reason, it clicked. I realized I felt so good afterward. I felt like I'd done something and not just punished myself. I mean, it was hard. And like you said, I appreciate this, is that when you see runners, typically they are not smiling. I mean, and even now, and I've been running real seriously for now a number of years, when I'm actually in the act of running, I can't say I'm really enjoying the hell out of it. I'm it's work. It's hard. but yet when you get done, there's few things that feel better afterward than when you've run. So that was that's my running journey. And then what was kind of cool about too for me was I got so hooked on it, I started running marathons. I ran my first marathon at age 55, and it was kind of that too was an interesting process where when I started running, I never aspired to be a marathon runner. My goal at first was to run that 5K. Well, then I ran the 5K so that was 2007. I ran another one in 2008. Then by 2009, I thought, I think this year I'll try to run a 10K, double the distance. So I ran a 10K. Then 2010, when I was like, I guess I would have been 54 then. I thought I'm going to run a half marathon, 13.1 miles. That was my big goal that year. And I did that. Well, then I realized, well, the next thing up is to run a full marathon. So when I was 55 years old, I downloaded one of these training plans for like $15 on one of these websites. Started listening to running podcasts. There's a podcast called the Marathon Training Academy. It's a young couple. Of course, they're now in their 40s, but I still consider that young. But they had this podcast, and so I started listening to that, and I thought, I can do this. So I ran a marathon when I was 55, and then another thing that was kind of fun, Howard, is when I got where I run a few marathons and realized I was fairly competitive for my age group, I thought, well, if I can ever qualify for Boston, that'd be a real accomplishment. So I started training. I followed this training plan that would get me in at a time qualifier for Boston. And then I did. I qualified for Boston when I was 60 years old, and then I qualified again when I was 62.
Wow.
So I'm now what's kind of interesting too is as a guy who's been running now for 14 years. You always know, because I started doing a lot of reading about marathon running too, and I knew that I was on borrowed time. That it's only a matter of time when you're in your 60s that your time's going to start declining. No matter how hard you work at keeping yourself fit, the age will always win. And so now I've been able to document my decline. So, well, but I'm still running, and I figured I might not be able to qualify for Boston ever again. I'm still running, and I'm still taking some satisfaction in that.
Fantastic. So, Patrick, in the final moments of our podcast before we, get to your website and social sites, one of the questions we often ask our guests who appear on the Success Insight podcast is to share for our listeners their what we call an insight to go. So this could be a quote, it could be an article, a book, or some recommendation that you would like to give our listeners that really kind of encapsulates a lot of your beliefs and how you live your life and, to inspire others. So what would be your insight to go?
Thank you. The thing that I often do, Howard, when I'm writing my weekly column is if I'm sitting here trying to craft how to get going into the piece, I just remind myself, take a stand. Basically state what you believe to be the truth, because I really do believe the truth is based on facts. It's not based on just opinion. That the truth, there is such a thing as objective truth. So I like to say, take a stand, and when you do, you will sleep better for it. Then you've not been wishy-washy. You basically let people know this is how I believe, and I think you can take a stand without being belligerent, without being in someone's face. You can just politely say, this is what I think about things. And I keep I'm one of these people who I've always loved reading about people in history, reading good writers who basically have taken a stand on various things. And one that I came across years ago, I remember when I was in the Navy, I used to read a lot. I had time sometimes to really read. And one of these great quotations I came across was from John Kennedy. the late President Kennedy, and he apparently he was a big reader of classics, and he crafted that. I'll read it to you. I'm looking at this plaque right now. I keep on my desk, and Kennedy had said, "The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a time of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality." And I thought, exactly. This is, when people who stay neutral when their time is called, when it's time for them to step up. The ones who stay neutral, history swallows them, and they're never heard from again. And I think probably rightfully so.
I appreciate that, and it's so appropriate for the times that we live in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to take a stand between right and wrong.
Yeah.
Patrick, before we head out, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Yeah. Two main things in our day of the internet here. PatrickDurkinOutdoors.com is my personal website where I keep all my weekly columns posted there, and I have links to other things that I write right there, and also podcast appearances. Then I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Patrick Durkin Outdoors.
Fantastic. Well, we will provide the backlinks to PatrickDurkinOutdoors.com, your website, and also the links back to your social sites on Facebook and Instagram. Patrick, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I mean, it's what an appropriate guest for our outdoor adventure series. And I truly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this. I know you probably have a couple words to write for your next article.
Sure.
And, I also, again, it was just a pleasure to meet you at the local conference back on the 23rd. And, appreciated the opportunity to get to know you and some of the other members as well. And hopefully we'll continue
I hope so.
That relationship
I hope
too.
So.
And, one thing we didn't chat about, and perhaps we'll have you back on, it's, you did a great job of herding cats at this conference. So I appreciated that. And I'm looking forward to the big group picture. So I'll share that on my social site.
I'll send it to you. Yeah.
Fantastic. And speaking of pictures, one of the, features we'd like to put out on our main website, successinsidepodcast.com, are photographs, especially of our guests doing what they do best. And what I would love if you have some outdoor photos, maybe some photos of you hunting, fishing with your daughters, or running across the finish line at the Boston Marathon.
Okay.
Just a couple pictures for us to share.
I can do that
on our website. And I think we already have your headshot. So we'll be okay there for the banners. But Patrick, once again, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for taking the time today.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Patrick Durkin. He's an outdoor recreation enthusiast, Wisconsin native. He's an award-winning writer, journalist, columnist, outdoors reporter, and now we know he's an accomplished marathoner. I may go out and hunt, but I'm not going to go out and run a marathon. I guarantee you that. But, just to kind of hear Patrick's story and, really since his early days and just the impact that his grandmother had on his life, and really, going into the Navy and the discipline obtained there, and really just making this wonderful career as a journalist, and love kind of hearing his stories. And so I hope you appreciated today's episode, and by all means go visit his sites at PatrickDurkinOutdoors.com, as well as the Facebook and Instagram pages. And again, we'll provide the backlinks there. And folks, if you enjoyed today's episode, please visit us on SuccessInsightPodcast.com. You can follow us there, leave a comment. You can also find us on LinkedIn and on Facebook, our Success Insight Podcast pages. And we are on just about all the major podcasting platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Spotify, especially Spotify, because we have our outdoor adventure series playlist. So you can listen to all of our outdoor episodes, especially the one with Patrick today. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Take care of yourselves, your family. If needed, practice social distancing and wear that mask. And we will see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.